From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, November 7th. Donald Trump is stronger than ever, and Republicans are riding high. It's possible, maybe even likely, the party will have majority control in both chambers of Congress. Oh, and the Supreme Court. Here in Oregon, it's a different story. Democrats appear to be as strong as ever. They dominated in statewide offices and appear to have a supermajority in one chamber so far. There weren't a ton of surprises. We'll go through the major results we know so far from election night and talk about what it all means. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics editor Andrew Thien.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
All right, Dirk, let's start with you. You were with the Democrats on election night. Take us behind the veil. This was a big party in downtown Portland. I imagine this was supposed to be a big to-do where everyone could celebrate Vice President Harris's win while toasting local candidates. But it wasn't so, was it?
It really wasn't. This was in the basement of the Hilton, where Democrats often hold their event. And, you know, I would say the vibe right when I got there at 7 p.m. was palpable anxiety. By that point, we had been seeing national returns for hours. There were all these TVs set up outside the ballroom that were blaring CNN and sort of clutches of, as I say, anxious Democrats watching the latest results, watching as Pennsylvania or Georgia or whatever state, you know, was trending toward Trump. So there just wasn't the opportunity for, the feeling I got, no opportunity for excitement to build. We obviously released our first results in Oregon at around 8 p.m. Those results looked very, very good for Oregon Democrats. Virtually every race they wanted to win, they seemed to be up in. But at the time, Governor Tina Kotek was on the stage right about as results were coming in. And this was not a super joyful message. This was a let's keep it together, guys, kind of speech. Here's some of what she said.
I know that we're all feeling the weight of this moment, the uncertainty, the tension, the knowledge that the future of our country is on the line tonight.
You know, not the kind of thing you typically see when you're about to take Secretary of State, Treasurer, you know, Attorney General. I mean, all these things where the Oregon results seem to be trending.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a ton of fun for a party. Was there music at least or anything like that?
I don't think there was music. I didn't see many people eating food. Drinks weren't free. I'm just going to say it, Oregon Democrats, not my favorite election night event I've covered.
Okay. Well, you picked up the phone, though. You started asking Republicans or Republican strategists how they were feeling, because even as the national landscape has shifted red, it was really kind of the same old show here in Oregon, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's what we wanted to talk to Republicans about yesterday was, oh, wow, you guys had a huge night nationally, and yet nothing seems to have changed on the ground. Like, what happened? And I heard a number of things from Republicans. The first is that in terms of the legislature, they just came to the conclusion that gerrymandering is a thing here. So, you know, Republicans, as we talked about on the podcast, had this sort of grand theory that particularly in the eastern suburbs of Portland, there were gains to be had. They felt like voters there really didn't like the way the country was going, as we saw a lot of voters nationally did not, that they didn't want these Portland policies and that they were going to be potentially more comfortable sending a Republican to Salem to represent them. And that just didn't come to pass. So what I heard yesterday is, you know, we are trying to dig out of these big holes in these districts, but ultimately Democrats wrote the maps and, you know, gerrymandering, as they would say, has come into play. Let's note that Republicans, I mean, these maps passed over the objections of Republicans, but they did pass the legislature. They didn't get kicked to the Secretary of State. You know, I think they think that Democrats used what they would call abortion scare tactics to worry voters, and that was pretty potent. And I think there's some hand-wringing among Republicans about potential strategy miscues. We talked on the podcast earlier about how all this money from former Congressman Greg Walden was coming in, but it was coming in pretty late, and Republicans wondered whether that was a misplay. And I think given some of the results we're seeing where Republicans didn't gain ground at all in the legislature, it looks like, I think that those criticisms are now becoming a little sharper.
After an election result, that's when the Monday morning quarterback
Yes.
comes in, right?
Yes.
Where people are like, what did we do wrong? What can we change? And That's some of the discussion here from the Republican side. Okay, so before we start talking about some of the more specific takeaways from election night, election week, whatever you want to call it, Lauren, turning to you, you were with the Republicans at their party. Again, using the phrase party loosely here because from what your dispatch entailed, it wasn't a place where you found some of the major candidates, right? Like the governor was at the Hilton, as Dirk said, but the major candidates on the Republican docket, like Lori Chavez-Dreamer and Will Lathrop, were they where you were on Tuesday?
No, the big headliners were not there. Clackamas County Chair Tootie Smith was there, but she left as it became sort of apparent that she was losing her race. It was a mellow scene, but people were eating. There were some hot wings. There was a buffet table. There was TVs playing Fox News in the background. There was a poster that's sort of rather iconic now of Donald Trump after the first assassination attempt where he was bloody and his fist was raised and it said, "Fight, fight, fight." People were taking that down toward the end of the night and posing with with photos with him. There was a lot of people dressed in red, white, and blue. One woman had this homemade dress on it that said, "Make America Great Again," across the bottom of it. And overall, the mood was really optimistic. I mean, people did not seem overly bummed out about the statewide races. The focus was really on the national races, on Donald Trump winning re-election. A lot of his supporters at the event were talking about how their lives were better when he was president. There was a lot of talk about the economy and the border. A lot of people there mentioned that they were Christians and that he embodied their Christian values. Overall, people just seemed hopeful and more happy than probably at the Democratic Party that Dirk was at.
You also caught up with Bruce Starr. He's a former lawmaker who's coming back, going to be a lawmaker again, has spent a lot of time in Salem. What's his take and how he views kind of the theme that we were discussing here between the kind of the struggles locally and then the national wins for his party?
Yeah, Bruce Starr has been around a long time. He served in the state legislature for something like 16 years, representing Hillsborough. He lives in Dundee now, and he will have Brian Boquist's seat in the state Senate. He's definitely conservative. He's a business owner. He's currently a Dundee city councilor. His dad was a state lawmaker. His family has been well known in conservative circles for a long time in this state. And he was happy. He won his race. He was happy about President Trump. But he was one of the few people I talked to who was willing to express some frustration about what happened at the state level for Republicans. Like a lot of people, he felt like Will Lathrop, the Republican candidate for Attorney General, had a shot at winning the AG race. So when it became clear that he was losing quite handily, he expressed some frustration that he does not understand why Oregonians will not consider voting for a Republican when things don't seem to be going particularly well in this state and when the state has been controlled by Democrats for a long time. So that was kind of his takeaway, is said, at what point are Oregon voters going to think like, hey, we need a change in the state?
Yeah, there's no shortage of public opinion polls dating back years that talk about how frustrated people are with the status quo, right? And yet here we are. I feel like this is a question I consistently have, and we've talked about this on the podcast several times, that Republicans in Oregon have not won statewide office effectively since the early 80s, aside from a couple exceptions. There are a couple U.S. senators. There's Dennis Richardson, Secretary of State, but there are Republicans in Oregon and non-affiliated voters who support these candidates or these issues, and it's not like Oregon Democrats are winning major popularity contests. Both former Governor Kate Brown and current Governor Tina Kotek have really low marks historically in terms of their popularity. So what gives here? Why weren't Republicans able to capitalize on major issues like Measure 110 and its effect in Portland and beyond? I know we've asked this question before, but any takeaways, Dirk?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a number of people about this too. There's a very basic, simple takeaway that I got from Chris Shortell. He's a Portland State University political science professor. That is, Democrats just have a built-in registration advantage. The numbers are with them in some respect. Obviously, we have a lot of non-affiliated voters in the state. You never quite know where they lie, but typically the numbers have been with Dems. Because of that, they've got a pretty sophisticated infrastructure in their party that Republicans might not have. And so he thinks that, on one level, it's just harder for Oregon and Washington Republicans to capitalize on some of this national mood stuff because they are not there with the weaponry, if you will, to bring into play when
the metaphorical weaponry, to be clear.
And I think Democrats, and by the way, I want to acknowledge that Democrats were not just fully glum. Like, there was enthusiasm at this party, especially when Andrea Salinas seemed to win her race, which hasn't been called yet. Like, a lot of people cheering. I think people were excited about Dan Rayfield becoming AG. But Dems would say that they really feel like they've earned this. And legislative Democrats I talked to yesterday say they are actually addressing some of these issues. They came in last session and helped craft this House Bill 4002, which rolled back Measure 110. They've been pouring a ton of money into housing policy. Here is House Majority Leader Ben Bowman, a Democrat from Tigard. He says what I heard from a lot of Democrats yesterday.
Over the last 2 years, we have had highly productive legislative sessions where the output of those sessions were bills that mapped perfectly onto the top priorities that Oregonians have repeatedly said were their top issues.
And so, there's that stuff, and it just takes a lot, I think. Red waves have hit Oregon before. We saw it in 2010, but it takes a little more in this part of the state, especially, we don't like Donald Trump here. The electorate does not. So I think it takes a little more for that to affect things here.
And just to build on Dirk's point for a second, the Democrats in the state, they have had a machine for decades. They have this pipeline where they train and recruit viable candidates. And they have this whole functioning apparatus that the Republicans just cannot compete with in the state. And Lathrop got a lot of attention because he was a viable candidate in the state, and that's not always the case. If you look at the two other Republicans who ran for statewide office this time around, the state treasurer and the Secretary of State race, they were not really considered competitive candidates. So Republicans also have to recruit, train, and find people who are, as I've said many times on this podcast, moderate enough to appeal to a statewide audience, but conservative enough not to alienate the base.
And let's note, too, we weren't immune to some of this stuff. We have a helpful chart on OPB.org right now that shows a lot of Oregon counties went more for Donald Trump than they did in 2020. So there are signs of this sort of vibe that have played out. It's just not enough in Oregon to move the needle to really impact at all who controls the state.
And looking back recently to the most recent governor's race, it was kind of an anomaly, right, where you had a third candidate in the race.
Yep.
That probably won't be the case in the next race. So I guess we'll see whether Republicans have a shot going forward in other races. But we can talk about that more in future podcasts. Dirk, let's turn to more specific measures instead of kind of the Monday morning quarterbacking here. We've been talking about what it means for Oregon. Again, we said there weren't a lot of surprises in the results, but that also includes the most expensive, the most divisive measure, Measure 118, which you covered so closely in the past few months. It went down, but maybe the surprise was how big it went down. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, the conventional wisdom with 118, and maybe it was wrong, was that this was a ballot measure that was promising every resident in the state $1,600 a year if they would simply vote to hike taxes on corporations that are making a lot of money. And just hammering that message home was going to be very salient for people, especially people that don't really pay that much attention and maybe weren't looking at all the critiques of it and were like, hey, money makes sense. I don't care that Walmart or Nike or whoever has to pay higher taxes. There seemed to be a sense that was going to be a very easy bubble to fill in. Obviously, we saw a huge opposition campaign to Measure 118, $15 or $16 million spent to convince people this was a hidden sales tax. There were real worries that it was going to blow a hole in the budget, and there was just a huge amount of opposition to it from politicians and groups of every political stripe. And so, yeah, what we see is about 80% no, I think a little under from the tallies I saw today. That's very, very big, given that people were essentially turning down what was being billed as free money. But it does seem that all the money spent on sort of trying to educate voters on the potential pitfalls of this really paid off.
What do you make of this outcome? I mean, what do you think it says about Oregon or Oregonians? I mean, the state keeps being sort of this petri dish for big progressive ideas and policies there's varying degrees of success.
And I'm not sure that we can draw conclusions on this because, one, I mean, I would say, Andrew, I think probably there was some real worry that, Measure 118's chief funding came from some folks in California. I think people have a hangover from Measure 110, which was bankrolled largely from national organizations that wanted to see their sort of policy ideas play out. Oregon doesn't want to be a guinea pig right now. I think that's pretty clear, and we feel maybe that Measure 110 was that kind of vibe. At the same time, though, I just don't know that this is fair to sort of base any conclusions on because this wasn't really a huge battle for the soul of the electorate, like we've seen maybe with Measure 97 8 years ago, which was like unions, progressive groups really hammering this corporate sales tax, businesses really opposed, and so a huge campaign, sort of equal arms on both sides, fighting for voters, and it went down. Here it was like everyone was saying, don't do this. And like the only, real messaging for it was like, you're going to get $1,600, but it wasn't being shouted at voters in the way that some of the critiques were. So I guess I just don't know. I hesitate to sort of make a big theory about Oregon voters based on 118.
Okay, we'll leave Measure 118 behind. Lauren, what stood out to you from the other statewide measures?
Yeah, well, I covered two measures that were both tied in some ways to former Secretary of State Shemia Fagan. And voters look to be approving Measure 115, which means Oregon will likely join every other state in the nation in making it possible to impeach elected officials. And the way that would work is that the state house could vote to impeach the elected official, and then the Senate would hold a trial to consider convicting them and removing them from office. And then it would take a 2/3 vote by the Senate to actually make that happen. And there's been talk of impeachment, in recent state history with both Secretary of State Fagan and former Governor John Kitzhaber, and both of them ultimately resigned. The other measure is Measure 116. That looks to be failing, and it's pretty straightforward. It would have created this independent commission that would have set salaries for the governor, the Secretary of State, lawmakers, judges, and that came up again with this issue of Secretary of State Fagan because at the time that she resigned, she was serving as Secretary of State. She noted that she was a single mom, and the Secretary of State makes $77,000 a year. And she said, that was not enough to support her family, which is why she had this lucrative side gig with a cannabis company that ultimately led to her downfall. The thing with lawmakers' pay has been an issue for a very long time. The idea is if the pay is too low, the thinking is that, it discourages people who are not independently wealthy from running from office. And so without higher wages, people feel like the state would continue to be predominantly represented by older, whiter, retired people without children living at home. Most people agree that something needs to happen with statewide and lawmakers' salaries, but people raise a lot of concerns about who would actually sit on this independent commission. And ultimately, I think that the voters agreed that there was too much nebulous details and not enough clarity around the measure.
All right. Well, turning back to the statewide races for offices a bit more, we talked a little bit about Will Lathrop earlier, but is there anything to be gleaned from the margins or the candidates or the tenor of these campaigns for Secretary of State, Treasurer, and Attorney General that could dictate how we see Republicans or Democrats campaign in the coming months or years?
I mean, I think a key takeaway, which has been a key takeaway for Republicans recently, is they need better candidates in some of these races. We had Dennis Linthicum. He's had success as a state senator in his Klamath district, but Oregonians are not going to vote up someone who has questioned vote by mail and essentially says that everyone, like our election results could be fake, to administer elections. They're also probably not going to vote for someone that isn't able to raise money and run a credible campaign. The reason why Will Lathrop was so compelling is, one, he had a lot of experience. He could speak credibly to the issues. And two, there seems to be this moment where Oregonians really aren't happy with some law and order type things that maybe the Attorney General can address. But I just think Republicans need, I know they always felt like they were going to have a bit of a high hill to climb in Oregon with Secretary of State just because of some of the things people in the party nationally are saying about elections. And maybe that wasn't going to be a winning play for Oregon voters. But I don't know. I feel like we've seen this in Senate races too. They just don't seem to have these candidates that really bring some of the gravitas that they might want to make a pitch to voters.
Yeah, and I talked to Julie Parrish yesterday, and she is a former state lawmaker and an attorney, right. And she was really instrumental in getting Dennis Richardson elected, and he was the last Republican to hold a statewide office. He served as Secretary of State. He died of brain cancer while he was serving in 2019. And, she said he was a conservative state lawmaker. But what he did that worked, Parrish said, was he steered away from national talking points. And he really, he campaigned in Portland, and he talked about auditing Portland public schools, and he talked about auditing the state's child welfare system. And he really honed in on specific local issues that resonated with voters and managed to steer clear away from, more national talking points that sometimes scare voters. And she hasn't seen a Republican candidate that has really managed to do that since Richardson.
And that was also a year where, Richardson did bring the kind of gravitas I'm talking about. He'd been around for a while, known quantity, very socially conservative, but was able to still prevail. But he also had, I think, what many people thought was a fairly weak Democratic candidate that year in Brad Avakian. So, a lot of things seem to have to go right. But I think that's very, very good point that Parrish made.
Okay, well, any other parting thoughts or partying thoughts or thoughts here on this fine Thursday?
I think not less a thought and more of a question, which is that, there is this sense among Democrats now that given the way things look in the federal government, state legislatures, state governments are going to have to be a bulwark for the party's policies if they are going to have any sort of success or try to hold the line in these coming years. And so the question we have had is, what does that mean for Oregon Democrats who again, are firmly in control of the state? Talking to some Republican consultants yesterday, they were wondering, does this mean that Democrats are just going to hammer their agenda as hard as they possibly can? Does it make the situation in Salem potentially more partisan because the Democrats here feel like they need to represent the party's policies on a more national scale or take some grander steps to sort of oppose a Trump agenda? And I don't know the answer to that, but that is questions we are going to ask. I think that is definitely going to be a dynamic in the legislative session and probably the next 4 years. So, how the Dems pivot with these majorities we're talking about could be very, very interesting.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you both for your amazing work this week, and thanks for coming on the pod to talk about it.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
This week's episode was produced by Anna Griffin, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back soon, how about tomorrow, with a bonus episode of Politics Now focusing on Portland politics and the new era coming to City Hall. While I have the mic, join Dirk and Lauren and the rest of the Politics Now team alongside OPB's Think Out Loud for a video live stream on Tuesday, November 12th at noon as they discuss the outcomes from key races and measures across the state and in Southwest Washington. We'll talk about what those implications may be, how they might affect the lives of Pacific Northwest residents like yourself, and much more. This live stream will be taking place on YouTube, so be sure you are a subscriber to our channel. That's at youtube.com/OPB, and have your notifications on to be alerted. It's a great way to start your week after a long holiday weekend. We'll leave it there for today. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.